So welcome to our garage. If you guys have been following the channel for a while, you've probably seen this place in quite a few videos. I've done a lot of storage related projects in here. I've also built quite a few projects in here, especially when I was building the tiny house. And while I've always had at least a few tools in here, I've never really had a proper shop setup in here. But today that is going to change because I'm going to be setting up what I consider to be the ultimate kind of weekend warrior wood shop here in this garage. And so like I do anytime I'm setting up a new shop space, I jumped into SketchUp first to figure out where I wanted all of the tools to end up. And then once I had that figured out, I could put together a to-do list of all the things I need to do in here before I start moving in my tools. And let me tell you, that to-do list is pretty long. So unfortunately, 3 of the 4 walls in this shop are uninsulated. One of those walls is mostly taken up by the garage door, which thankfully is insulated, so I'm not gonna bother with that wall. But these 2 exterior walls are gonna need to be insulated if I want to keep this space climate controlled, which is definitely a high priority for me in shop spaces, and not just for my comfort. Because as any of you who work in unconditioned spaces will know, having your shop be too cold or too hot can cause lots of issues with things like finishes, epoxies, glue. If things are too cold, they're not gonna set up properly. And if things are too hot, they're gonna set up too quickly. And it's just gonna make using all of those types of things a lot less predictable. The other big advantage of removing this drywall so I can add that insulation is that the walls will be opened up for me to add lots of new circuits, which I'm definitely gonna need. There are only a handful of outlets in this garage. There are no 220 volt outlets out here, so I will be adding a sub panel next to our main panel here, and then running all of the shop related circuits into there. So that way, if my kids are out here hanging out, I can just flip the main breaker on the sub panel, and I'll know that none of my larger power tools will be able to be turned on by my kids. But before we get started with any of that, obviously I have a lot of cleanup work to do in here. I need to get everything removed from these 2 walls and get this stuff out of my way so I can get to work. And I guess that means it's time for a garage clean out time-lapse montage. Once I had the first wall cleaned off, I could start the drywall removal. I removed the baseboard and then scored the seam where 2 sheets met up, which makes it easier to keep larger sections intact. And this is the big difference between how the home improvement shows like to remove drywall and how people do it in real life. If you go at your drywall with a sledgehammer, you're just gonna make a huge mess, which will mean a lot more cleanup work later on. Instead, if you can pull the drywall off in larger chunks, it'll keep the dust to a minimum and make disposing of the sheets a lot easier. Also, my younger son Chris wanted to help with the demo work, and this is one of the reasons I'm excited to have a shop set up here at the house, so my 2 boys can more easily be involved out in the shop.
Oh, yeah! Yeah!
There you go. Good job.
Whoa. Okay, now can I do that?
Sure. What do you think?
That's pretty good.
Pretty good. Chris and I kept removing sections, and then he helped me remove some of the drywall screws and nails that were left behind in the studs. That's it. There you go. Yeah, nice.
Whoa.
There you go. The next day I set up some scaffolding, which is a huge help on projects like this, and the ceilings in the garage are 10 feet high, and removing these sheets on the top row with just a ladder would have been super awkward and a little dangerous. Next, I continued working on the back wall, first clearing out all the stuff, including some of the above garage storage shelves I built in here years ago. I continued removing the drywall from the back wall, which went super quick, and then I spent a little time cleaning up so I didn't track drywall dust all over the place. I also went around and removed all of the drywall screws and nails, all of which needed to be removed before the plywood walls can go up later. And after working on each stud, I ran my hammer along the stud just to make sure I didn't miss anything, and the hammer would catch on any leftover fasteners. While I'm working, let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Sweet Night. So Sweet Night is a mattress and sleep solutions company that provides quality products to ensure great daily sleep. I've personally been sleeping on a Sweet Night mattress for the past 2.5 years, and the mattress has been comfortable, supportive, and has all around provided me with a great sleeping experience. And that's why I was super excited when Sweet Night reached out for me to try one of their new mattresses with their new Cool Nest system. So Sweet Night's Cool Nest mattresses feature a breathable 3D knit cover, which provides 35% more breathability, as well as their specially designed PCM Flux foam, which has 3 times the ventilation of traditional foam. And these two features combine to make for a mattress that sleeps up to 8 degrees cooler than a traditional foam mattress. These new mattresses also feature Sweet Night's ErgoZone technology, and this innovative 5-zone design features a combination of support foam and comfort bars, which target key pressure points across your body. By addressing specific areas like your head, shoulders, back, hips, and feet, ErgoZone alleviates pressure, providing you with a more comfortable, supportive sleep experience. And after sleeping on this new mattress for the past few weeks, I can definitely tell the difference, and this mattress sleeps much cooler than your typical foam mattress. It's also supportive in all the right places, which is huge for me since I struggle with chronic back pain. So if you'd like to try a Sweet Night mattress for yourself and see why Cool Nest is the best choice for cooler nights, use my code Johnny25 to unlock 25% off on your new mattress. Thanks again to Sweet Night for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. All right, so now that the drywall is out of here, I can move on to the next big step in renovating this garage space, and that is working on the electrical. Thankfully, our main panel is here in the garage, so it'll be very simple to add a bunch of new circuits in here. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I am gonna be running all of these new shop circuits out of a sub panel. So speaking of sub panels, when I was looking around at the different options out there, I had to choose between either a very small sub panel that would have basically been full right off the bat once I got all the new circuits added, or one that was really kind of too big, but that would leave me with a lot of room to expand if needed in the future. And I think it's always a good idea to leave yourself that kind of option, because you never know what kind of tools you might add to your shop at some point down the line. And so I went with this larger sub panel, which has 20 spaces or 40 circuits. But again, a lot of these are gonna be 240 volt circuits, so those are gonna take up 2 of those circuits. And so I definitely don't think I will regret having a little extra room there. But as far as the sub panel location, I'm just gonna put it right here, right next to the main panel. It'll make it a lot easier to run the very large wires I'm gonna need to run to this. I'm gonna be running this sub panel off of a 125 amp breaker, so obviously there will be a lot of juice potentially flowing through those wires. And I did actually mount this sub panel upside down, which is allowed, and that'll just make running those big wires from the breaker, which will be located down here towards the bottom of our main panel, over into the sub panel, and the terminals will be on the bottom as well, to just make things a little simpler. But so now that I've figured out where the sub panel is going to be, I can go ahead and start figuring out where all of my outlet boxes need to be. And so I went ahead and put together a little electrical plan here, listing out all the different circuits I'm going to need for my larger tools, and then where I'm going to want my 120 volt outlets. I don't think you can ever have too many 120 volt outlets in a shop, so I'm going to space mine about 6 feet apart. I actually have a ton of Romex and outlet boxes left from one of my previous shop spaces that I pulled out when I was demoing that space, so it'll be easy enough to go ahead and add those. And then once the outlet boxes are in place, I can get started actually pulling the Romex. I went ahead and set up a line laser at the height I wanted all of my outlets, and then I could start laying out the exact location of the outlet boxes. I used 2 gang boxes for the 120 volt outlets and spaced them between 5 and 6 feet apart, depending on the stud layout. I used 3-inch deck screws to mount the boxes since, as I mentioned, these had been pulled out of one of my previous shop spaces and the nails were removed at that point. I got the rest of the boxes mounted on the left wall, and this wall had a lot more outlets since a lot of my 240 volt machines will live on this wall. Once the boxes were mounted, I set my line laser to where I wanted to run the Romex through the studs, and then drilled a series of 1-inch holes through the studs in these locations. And you're allowed to drill a hole up to 40% of the width of the stud by code, and I made sure to keep the hole centered on the studs since nailing plates are required to protect the Romex if the holes are too close to the front edge. After drilling the holes, I could start running some Romex, starting on the back wall. And I like to have every other 120 volt outlet box on a different circuit, which just helps to keep from overloading the circuits. To accomplish this, I ran the Romex between the 120 volt outlet boxes, stapling the Romex about 6 inches from the outlet box to secure it. After running the Romex between the boxes, I could run a wire from the sub panel to the first box to finish the circuit. I also ran some 10 gauge Romex for a 30 amp outlet for a potential CNC, which will be added later on to this shop. And since this circuit is dedicated to this outlet, I could just run one wire from the outlet back to the sub panel. I repeated the process on the left wall, and I made sure to label the end of the Romex nearest the panel with each of the circuit names, just to keep things straight when it came time to run the Romex into the panel. And before I knew it, all of the Romex was ran from the boxes to the sub panel. It was at this point that I realized the area I had planned to run the conduit from our main panel to the sub panel was a little too crowded with other wiring, which meant I needed to slightly adjust the location of the sub panel. And after removing the sub panel, I could get the conduit run through the new location through the right side of our main panel. I used 1.25" EMT conduit, and in order to fit the conduit connector, I needed to drill a 2-inch hole through the stud. And this is obviously over that code allowance I mentioned earlier, but I have a solution for this, which I'll show in a bit. After drilling the hole, I removed the knockout in the panel and then added the connector using a screwdriver to tighten the lock nut. And it was also at this point that I should have added the insulated bushing, which protects the wire from being damaged by the metal fittings, and this is something I had to come back and add later. I needed to cut down the EMT conduit elbow slightly since it needed to end up centered in the stud bay to line up with the knockout on the sub panel. A portaband or hacksaw make quick work of this, and I made sure to use some sandpaper to smooth out the cut edges, removing any burrs which could damage the wire. Next, I removed the knockout from the sub panel and installed the connector, which again should have had that insulated bushing, and then I could get the sub panel set in place. With the sub panel permanently installed, it was time for the hard part, running the massive 1/0 wire from the sub panel to the main panel. I needed to run 3 of the 1/0 wires, 2 hots and 1 neutral, plus a 6-gauge ground. And once the wires were run through the conduit, I started by landing the neutral wire, which was easier said than done. So as you can see, our main panel is pretty darn full, so I had to get a little creative with how I got the wire installed in the lug on the neutral bus bar, but after a decent amount of cursing, I got it done. Once the neutral was installed, I added white electrical tape to the wire to indicate that it's a neutral wire, which is another code requirement. I wrapped up the neutral installation by landing the other end of the wire in the sub panel in the neutral lug, and of course my big cable cutter was over at my main shop, so it was a major struggle cutting this 1/0 wire with diagonal cutters and lineman's pliers. After cutting the wire to length, I stripped the sheathing by first scoring it with my lineman's pliers, then cutting off the sheathing with a utility knife. Finally, I could install the wire in the neutral lug, and this 1/0 wire was definitely the maximum size for these lugs. It just barely fit.
There we go. Okay. Woo! Godly.
And I did torque all these connections to spec, which I'll show later, but after the initial tightening, I repeated the electrical tape labeling to wrap up the neutral. Next, I got the ground bus bar installed, and this bus bar is designed for this sub panel and just attaches with a single screw. Once the bus bar was in, I got the ground wire running from the main panel installed, once again labeling the wire with green electrical tape to indicate that it's a ground wire. I landed the other end of the ground wire in one of the ground bus bars in the main panel, which wrapped up the ground wire install, and then it was time for the really hard part, installing the 125 amp breaker with the 1/0 wire. I started by stripping the wire and attaching the 2 wires to the breaker, and then it was time for the struggle fest that was seating the breaker in the main panel. After struggling more than I'd like to admit, I realized I was trying to snap the breaker in the wrong direction, hence why I was having so much difficulty, and after doing it the right way, the breaker went right in.
Oh my God, yes. Whew. Let me tell you, it really helps if you put the breaker in the right way. Holy crap.
Finally, I could get the 2 hot legs landed in the sub panel, which was a total breeze compared to installing the breaker. Then it was time to test out the sub panel.
Phew, let me tell you what, that was some tough work. This 1/0 wire is no joke. It is extremely stiff and hard to bend into these positions, hard to cut, but I've got everything landed, and so now we can flip this breaker on, and then we can check to make sure all our voltages are what they should be. So first we will go from hot to hot. This is our 240 volts. There we go, we got 247. Then we can go from ground to one of the hots. That should be about 120. Yep, we got 124. Ground to the other hot, 124. And then ground to neutral should be nothing, and it is nothing. So we know now that this sub panel is wired correctly, and so now I can move forward with landing all of my Romex in here and then starting to get those circuits wired up.
Before landing the Romex, I went ahead and torqued all of the connections according to the specs on the panel.
50 pounds of torque here on the main terminals. Do the same thing on the breaker. And for the ground connection, we're looking for 35, so we can back this off. And anytime it clicks, that means you've hit your torque rating.
Once everything was torqued to spec, I could move on with getting the Romex landed in the sub panel, and I started by getting the breakers installed where I wanted them. And these breakers were really tight, I think because this is a new panel, but they took a little extra persuasion to get them installed. After adding the breakers, I got the Romex ran into the panel. I installed these strain relief bushings, which both keep the Romex from being damaged by the metal panel, but also keep the Romex from being pulled out. I ran the rest of the Romex through the bushings, then connected the Romex to the panel. On the 120 volt circuits, this included stripping the sheathing, connecting the hot to the breaker, the neutral to the neutral bus bar, and the ground to the ground bus bar. On the 240 volt circuits, both the black and white wires are hot, so they're both connected to the breakers, and then the ground is connected to the ground bus bar. Thankfully, even with having to move the sub panel, only one of my wires ended up too short, just due to the location of the ground bus bar. This was an easy fix with one of these Wago inline connectors, and these are completely code compliant as long as they're in a box, and they're a great option if you need to extend some wiring if you're reconfiguring your panel. Next, I repeated the whole process for the circuits on the back wall, which were run through the top of the panel. Finally, to wrap up the sub panel installation, I installed the panel cover, removing the necessary knockouts. Then I labeled the panel referencing a photo I took of the wiring with the panel cover off. With that, the sub panel installation was a wrap, and the last thing to do to prep for the insulation to go in was to deal with that oversized hole I had to drill for the conduit earlier. So one option would have been to double up this stud, but that was a no-go here considering the sub panel wouldn't have fit in this spot if I did that. Instead, I added what's called a stud shoe, which is basically just a metal bracket that reinforces the section of the stud with the hole. Installing the stud shoe was easy. I just wedged it in place and then added 1.5 inch structural screws in all 10 holes. And you have to add a fastener to every hole for these to meet code requirements. And by pure luck, one of the holes lined up with the mounting hole for the panel, and I was able to remove a knockout to get at the other hole. So as I mentioned, next on the to-do list was insulating these two exterior walls. And when looking around at my options for insulation, I had a few choices to make. First, there was fiberglass versus mineral wool insulation. Mineral wool was going to be 2.5 times more expensive for the exact same R value, and I just didn't think that was worth it considering these are exterior walls. The other choice I had to make was batt versus roll insulation, and batt insulation is really designed for standard 8-foot high walls since it's cut to fit those openings. Since my garage walls are 10 feet tall, roll insulation made more sense, and it was also about 30% cheaper. I paid a local insulation crew to install the insulation, and I personally hate working with this stuff, plus the pros just get this work done way faster. And it was really exciting to get the insulation checked off my list because it meant I could finally get the walls closed back up. I also got some before and after shots of the walls with my FLIR thermal camera, and you can see just how big of a difference adding the insulation made. I still have some air sealing work to do with the garage door, but this insulation will make a huge difference in keeping the garage climate controlled. So as you can see, I've already started installing these plywood walls here in the garage, and that will be in next week's video. So if you don't want to miss that, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell. I'll have links to all the tools and materials I used in the video description below. And last, if you need a little help improving your woodworking, check out my beginner woodworking course, Jumpstart Your Woodworking. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next time, happy building.